Hi guys. So I'm going to read Nancy Drew, The Hidden Staircase. The last chapter we were on was chapter 6. Now chapter 6, The Gorilla Face, was the last one. So I'm just going to do a little recap at the end of that chapter. And then I'll move on to chapter 7, The Frightening Eyes. Oh, I'll be so happy to meet your father, said Miss Flora. We may need legal advice in this mystery. There was a pause after this remark, with everyone silent for a few moments. Suddenly, each one in the group looked at the other startled. From somewhere upstairs came the plaintive strains of violin music. Had the radio been turned on again by the ghost? Nancy dashed from the table to find out. So that was the end of chapter 6. Now we're moving on. Chapter 7, Frightening Eyes. Within 5 seconds, Nancy had reached the second floor. The violin playing suddenly ceased. She raced into Miss Flora's room, from which the sounds had seemed to come. The radio was not on. Quickly, Nancy felt the instrument to see if it was even slightly warm to prove that it had been in use. The music wasn't being played in on this, she told herself, finding the radio cool. As Nancy dashed from the room, she almost ran into Helen. What did you find out? Her friend asked breathlessly. Nothing so far, Nancy replied, as she raced into Aunt Rosemary's room to check the bedside radio in there. This instrument, too, felt cool to the touch. She and Helen stood in the center of the room, puzzled frowns creasing their foreheads. There was music, wasn't there? Helen questioned. I distinctly heard it, Nancy replied. But where is the person who played the violin? Or put a disc on a record player? Or turned on a hidden radio? Helen, I'm positive an intruder comes into this mansion by some secret entrance and tries to frighten us all. And succeeds, Helen answered. It's positively eerie. And dangerous, Nancy thought. Let's continue our search right after breakfast tomorrow, Helen proposed. Oh, we will, Nancy responded. But in the meantime, I believe Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary, to say nothing of ourselves, need some police protection. I think you're right, Helen agreed. Let's go downstairs and suggest it to the others. The girls returned to the first floor, and Nancy told Mrs. Hayes and her mother of the failure to find the cause of the violin playing and what she had in mind. Oh dear, the police will only laugh at us, Miss Flora objected. Mother dear, said her daughter, the captain and his men didn't believe us before because they thought we were imagining things. But Nancy and Helen heard music at 2 different times, and they saw the chandelier rock. I'm sure that Captain Rossland will believe Nancy and send a guard out here. Nancy smiled at Miss Flora. I shan't ask the captain to believe in a ghost or even hunt for one. I think we all should request at this moment that we have a man patrol the grounds here at night. I'm sure we're perfectly safe while we're awake, but I must admit I'd feel a little uneasy about going to bed, wondering what that ghost may do. Mrs. Turnbull finally agreed to the plan, and Nancy went to the telephone. Captain Rossland readily agreed to send a man out a little later. He'll return each night as long as you need him, the officer stated, and I'll tell him not to ring the bell to tell you when he comes. If there is anyone who breaks into the mansion by a secret entrance, it would be much better if he does not know a guard is on duty. Oh, I understand, said Nancy. When Miss Flora, her daughter, and the 2 girls went to bed, they were confident they would have a restful night. Nancy felt if there was no disturbance, then it would indicate that the ghost's means of entry into Twin Elms was directly from the outside. In which case, she thought, it will mean that he saw the guard and didn't dare come inside the house. The young sleuth's desire for a good night's sleep was rudely thwarted as she awakened about midnight with a start. Nancy was sure that she had heard a noise nearby, but now the house was quiet. Nancy listened intently and finally got out of bed. Perhaps the noise I heard came from outdoors, she told herself. Tiptoeing to a window so that she would not awaken Helen, Nancy peered out at the moonlit grounds. Shadows, made by tree branches which swayed in a gentle breeze, moved back and forth across the lawn. The scent from a rose garden in full bloom was wafted to Nancy. Oh, what a heavenly night, she thought. Suddenly Nancy gave a start. A furtive figure had darted from behind a tree toward a clump of bushes. Was he the guard or the ghost? She wondered. As Nancy watched intently to see if she could detect any further movements of the mysterious figure, she heard padding at footsteps in the hall. In a moment there was a loud knock on the door. "Nancy, Nancy, wake up! Nancy, wake up! Come quick!" The voice was Miss Flora's, and she sounded extremely frightened. Nancy sped across the room, unlocked her door, and opened it wide. By this time Helen was wide awake and out of bed. "What happened?" she asked sleepily. Aunt Rosemary had come into the hall also. Her mother did not say a word, just started back towards her own bedroom. The others followed, wondering what they would find. Moonlight brightened part of the room, but the area near the hall was dark. "There! Up there!" Miss Flora pointed to a corner of the room near the hall. Two burning eyes looked down on the watchers. Instantly Nancy grabbed on the wall light, and the group gazed upward at a large brown owl perched on an old-fashioned ornamental picture molding. "Oh!" Aunt Rosemary cried out. "How did that bird ever get in here?" The others did not answer at once. Then Nancy, not wishing to frighten Miss Flora, remarked as casually as she could, "It probably came down the chimney." "But," Helen started to say. Nancy gave her friend a warning wink, and Helen did not finish the sentence. Nancy was sure that she was going to say that the damper had been closed and the bird could not possibly have flown into the room from the chimney. Turning to Miss Flora, Nancy asked whether or not her bedroom door had been locked. "Oh, yes," the elderly woman insisted. "I wouldn't leave it unlocked for anything." Nancy did not comment. Knowing that Miss Flora was a bit forgetful, she thought it quite possible that the door had not been locked. An intruder had entered, let the owl fly to the picture molding, and then made just enough noise to awaken the sleeping woman. To satisfy her own memory about the damper, Nancy went over to the fireplace and looked inside. The damper was closed. But if the door to the hall was locked, she reasoned, then the ghost had some other way of getting into this room, and he escaped the detection of the guard. "I don't want that owl in here all night," Miss Flora broke into Nancy's reverie. "We have to get it out of here." "Oh, that's not going to be easy," Aunt Rosemary spoke up. "Owls have very sharp claws and beaks, and they use them viciously on anybody who tries to disturb them. Mother, you come and sleep in my room the rest of the night. We'll chase the owl out in the morning." Nancy urged Miss Flora to go with her daughter. "I'll stay here and try getting Mr. Owl out of the house. Have you a pair of old heavy gloves?" "I have some in my room," said Aunt Rosemary replied. "They're thick leather. I use them for gardening." She brought them to Nancy, who put the gloves on at once. Then she suggested that Aunt Rosemary and her mother leave. Nancy smiled. "Helen and I will take over Operation Owl." As the door closed behind the two women, Nancy dragged a chair to the corner of the room beneath the bird. She was counting on the fact that the bright overhead light had dulled the owl's vision, and then she would be able to grab it without too much trouble. "Helen, will you open one of the screens, please?" she requested. "And wish me luck." "Don't let that thing get loose," Helen warned as she unfastened the screen and held it far out. Nancy reached up, and by stretching was just able to grasp the bird. In a lightning movement she had put two hands round its body and imprisoned its claws. At once the owl began to bob its head and peck at her arms above the gloves. Wincing with pain, she stepped down from the chair and ran across the room. The bird squirmed, darting its beak first in one direction and then another. But Nancy managed to hold on to the owl in such a position that most of the pecking missed its goal. She held the bird out the window, released it, and stepped back. Helen closed the screen and quickly fastened it. "Oh," Nancy said, gazing ruefully at her wrist, which now showed several bloody digs from the owl's beak. "Oh, I'm glad that's over." "And I am too," said Helen. "Let's lock Miss Flora's door from the outside so the ghost can't bring in any owls to the rest of us." Suddenly Helen grabbed Nancy's arm. "I just thought of something," she said. "There's supposed to be a police guard outside, yet the ghost got in here without even being seen. Either that, or there's a secret entrance to this mansion which runs underground, probably to one of the outbuildings on the property." Nancy now told about the furtive figure she had seen dart from behind a tree. I must find out right away if he was the ghost or the guard. I'll do a little snooping around. It's possible the guard didn't show up. Nancy smiled. But if he did, and he's any good, he'll find me. All right, said Helen. But Nancy, do be careful. You're really taking awful chances to solve the mystery of Twin Elms. Nancy laughed softly as she walked back to the girl's bedroom. She dressed quickly, then went downstairs, put the back door key in her pocket, and let herself out of the house. Stealthily, she went down the steps and glided to a spot back of some bushes. Seeing no one around, she came from behind them and then ran across the lawn to a large maple tree. She stood among the shadows for several moments, then darted out toward a building which in colonial times had been used as the kitchen. Halfway there she heard a sound behind her and turned. A man stood in the shadows not 10 feet away. Quick as a wink, one hand flew to a holster on his hip. "Halt!" he commanded. And now we're on Chapter 8, A Startling Plunge. Nancy halted as directed and stood facing the man. "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm a police guard, miss," the man replied. "Just call me Patrick." "And who are you?" Quickly Nancy explained and then asked to see his identification. He opened his coat, pulled out a leather case, and showed her his shield, proving that he was a plainclothesman. His name was Tom Patrick. "Have you seen anyone prowling around the grounds?" Nancy asked him. "Not a soul, miss. This place has been quieter than a cemetery tonight." When the young sleuth told him about the furtive figure she had seen from the window, the detective laughed. "I believe you saw me," he said. "I guess I'm not so good at hiding as I thought I was." Nancy laughed lightly. "Anyway, you soon nabbed me," she told him. The two chatted for several minutes. Tom Patrick told Nancy that people in Cliffwood regarded Mrs. Turnbull as being a little queer. They said that if she thought her house was haunted, it was all in line with the stories of the odd people who had lived there from time to time during the past 100 years or so. "Would this rumor make the property difficult to sell?" Nancy questioned the detective. "Oh, it certainly would." Nancy said that she thought the whole thing was a shame. Mrs. Turnbull is one of the loveliest women I have ever met, and there's not a thing the matter with her, except that once in a while she is forgetful. "You don't think that some of these happenings we've heard about are just pure imagination?" Tom Patrick asked. "No, I don't." Nancy now told him about the owl in Miss Flora's bedroom. "The door was locked, every screen was fastened, and the damper in the chimney was closed. You tell me how the owl got in there." Tom Patrick's eyes opened wide. "You say this only happened a little while ago?" he queried. When Nancy nodded, he added, "Of course, I can't be everywhere on the grounds at once, but I've been round and round the building. I have never stopped walking since I arrived. I don't see how anybody could have gotten inside that mansion without my seeing him." "I'll tell you my theory," said Nancy. "I believe there's a secret underground entrance from some other place on the grounds. It may be in one of these outbuildings. Anyway, tomorrow morning I'm going to go search for it." "Well, I wish you luck," Tom Patrick said, "and if anything happens during the night, I will let you know." Nancy pointed to a window on the second floor. "That's my room," she said. "If you don't have a chance to use the door knocker, just throw a stone up against the screen to alert me. I'll wake up instantly, I know." The guard promised to do this, and Nancy went back into the mansion. She climbed the stairs, and for a second time that night, undressed. Helen had already gone back to sleep, so Nancy crawled into the big double bed noiselessly. The two girls woke up the next morning about the same time, and immediately Helen asked for full details of what Nancy had learned outdoors the night before. After hearing how her friend had been stopped by the guard, she shivered. "Oh, you might have been in real danger, Nancy, not knowing who he was. You must be more careful. Suppose that man had been a ghost." Nancy laughed, but made no reply. The girls went downstairs and started to prepare breakfast. In a few The girls went downstairs and started to prepare breakfast. In a few minutes Aunt Rosemary and her mother joined them. "Did you find out anything more last night?" Mrs. Hayes asked Nancy. Only that a police guard named Tom Patrick is on duty, Nancy replied. As soon as breakfast was over, the young sleuth announced that she was about to investigate all of the outbuildings on the estate. I'm going to search for an underground passage leading to the mansion. It's just possible that we hear no hollow sounds when we tap the walls, because of double doors or walls where the entrance is. Aunt Rosemary looked at Nancy intently. You are a real detective, Nancy. I see now why Helen wanted us to ask you to find our ghosts. Nancy's eyes twinkled. I may have some instinct for sleuthing, she said, but unless I can solve this mystery, it won't do us much good. Turning to Helen, she suggested that they put on the old clothes that they had brought with them. Attired in sport shirts and jeans, the girls left the house. Nancy led the way to the old ice house. She rolled back the creaking sliding door and gazed within. The tall, narrow building was about 10 feet square. On one side were a series of sliding doors, one above the other. I have heard Miss Flora say, Helen spoke up, that in days gone by, huge blocks of ice were cut from the river when it was frozen over, and dragged here on a sledge. The blocks were stored here and taken off from the top down through these various sliding doors. That story rather rules out the possibility of any underground passage leading from this building, said Nancy. I presume there was ice in here most of the year. The floor was covered with dank sawdust, and although Nancy was sure she would find nothing of interest beneath it, still she decided to take a look. Seeing an old rusted shovel in one corner, she picked it up and began to dig. There was only dirt beneath the sawdust. Well, that clue fizzled out, Helen remarked as she and Nancy started for the next building. This had once been a smokehouse. It, too, had an earthen floor. In one corner was a small fireplace where smoldering fires of hickory wood had been once burned. The smoke had curled up a narrow chimney to the second floor, which was windowless. Rows and rows of huge chunks of pork hung up here on hooks to be smoked, Helen explained, and days later turned into luscious hams and bacon. There was no indication of any secret opening, and Nancy went outside the small, two-story, peak-roofed structure and walked around. Up on one side of the brick building and leading to a door above were the remains of a ladder. Now only the side pieces which had once held the rungs remained. Give me a boost, will you, Helen? Nancy requested. I want to take a look inside. Helen squatted on the ground, and Nancy climbed up to her shoulders. Then Helen, bracing her hands against the wall, straightened up. Nancy opened the half-rotted wooden door. No ghost here, she announced. Nancy jumped to the ground and started for the servants' quarters, but a thorough inspection of this brick and wood structure failed to reveal a clue to a secret passageway. There was only one outbuilding left to investigate, which Helen had said was the old carriage house. This was built of brick and was fairly large. No carriages stood on its wooden floor, but around the walls hung old harnesses and reins. Nancy paused a moment to examine one of the bridles. It was set with two hand-painted medallions of women's portraits. Suddenly her reflection was interrupted by a scream. Turning, she was just in time to see Helen plunge through a hole in the floor. In a flash, Nancy was across the carriage house and looking down into a gaping hole where the rotted floor had given way. "Helen!" she cried out in alarm. "I'm all right," came a voice from below. "Nice and soft down here. Please throw me your flashlight." Helen removed the flashlight from the pocket of her jeans and tossed it down. "I thought maybe I'd discovered something," Helen said, "but this is just plain old hole. Give me a hand, will you, so I can climb back up." Nancy lay flat on the floor and with one arm gripped a supporting beam that stood in the center of the carriage house. Reaching down with the other arm, she assisted Helen in her ascent. "We'd better watch our step around here," Nancy said, as her friend once more stood beside her. "You're so right," Helen agreed, brushing dirt off her jeans. Helen's plunge had given Nancy an idea that there might be other openings in the floor and that one of them could be an entrance to a subterranean passage. But though she flashed her light over every inch of the carriage house floor, she could discover nothing suspicious. "Let's quit," Helen suggested. "I'm a mess, and besides, I'm hungry." "All right," Nancy agreed. "Are you game to search the cellar this afternoon?" "Oh, sure." After lunch, they started to investigate the storerooms in the cellar. There was a cool stone room where barrels of apples had once been kept. There was another, formerly filled with bags of whole wheat flour, barley, buckwheat, and oatmeal. And everything was grown on the estate, said Helen. Oh, it must have been perfectly wonderful, Nancy said. I wish we could go back in time and see how life was like in those days. Maybe if we could, we'd know how to find that ghost, Helen remarked. Nancy thought so too. As the girls went from room to room in the cellar, Nancy beamed her flashlight over every inch of wall and floor. At times, the young sleuth's pulse would quicken when she thought she had discovered a trapdoor or a secret opening, but each time she had to admit failure. There was no evidence of either one in the cellar. This has been a discouraging day, Nancy remarked, sighing, but I'm not giving up. Helen felt sorry for her friend. To cheer Nancy up, she said with a laugh, storeroom after storeroom, but no room to store a ghost. Helen had to laugh, and together the two girls ascended the stairway to the kitchen. After changing their clothes, they helped Aunt Rosemary prepare the evening dinner. When the group had eaten, and later gathered in the parlor, Nancy reminded the others that she had expected her father to arrive the same day. Dad didn't want me to bother meeting him, but I just can't wait to see him. I think I'll meet all the trains from Chicago that stop here. I hope your father will stay with us for 2 or 3 days, Miss Flora spoke up. Surely he'll have some ideas about our ghost. And good ones too, Nancy said. If he's on the early train, he'll have breakfast with us. All meet at 8 o'clock. But later that evening, Nancy's plans were suddenly changed. Hannah Gruen telephoned her to say that a man at the telegraph office had called the house a short time before to read a message from Mr. Drew. He had been unavoidably detained, and he would not arrive on Wednesday. In the telegram, your father said that he will let us know when he will arrive, the housekeeper added. Oh, I'm disappointed, Nancy remarked, but I hope this delay means that Dad is on the trail of Willie Wharton. Speaking of Willie Wharton, said Hannah, I heard something about him today. Well, what was that? Nancy asked. That he was seen down by the river right here in River Heights a couple of days ago. Chapter 9. A Worrisome Delay. You say Willie Wharton was seen in River Heights down by the river? Nancy asked unbelievingly. Yes, Hannah replied. I learned it from our postman, Mr. Ritter, who is one of the people that sold property to the railroad. As you know, Nancy, Mr. Ritter is very honest and reliable. Well, he said he'd heard that some of the property owners were trying to horn in on this deal of Willie Wharton's for getting some more money. Mr. Ritter wouldn't have a thing to do with it. He calls it a hold-up. Did Mr. Ritter himself see Willie Wharton? Nancy asked eagerly. No, the housekeeper replied. One of the other property owners told him that Willie was around. That man could have been mistaken, Nancy suggested. Of course he might, Hannah agreed, and I'm inclined to think he is. If your father is staying over in Chicago, it must be because of Willie Wharton. Nancy did not tell Hannah about what was racing through her mind. She said goodnight cheerfully, but actually she was very, very much worried. Maybe Willie Wharton was seen down by the river, she mused, and maybe Dad was unavoidably detained by an enemy of his in connection with the railroad bridge project. One of the dissatisfied property owners might have followed him to Chicago. Or, she reflected further, it was not inconceivable that Mr. Drew had found Willie Wharton only to have Willie hold the lawyer prisoner. As Nancy sat lost in anxious thought, Helen came into the hall. Is something the matter? She asked. I don't know, Nancy replied, but I have a feeling there is. Dad telegraphed to say that he wouldn't be here tomorrow. Instead of wiring, he always phones me or Hannah or his office when he is away, and it seems strange that he didn't do so this time. You told me a few days ago that your father had been threatened, said Helen. Are you afraid it has something to do with that? Yes, I am. Is there anything I can do? Helen offered. Thank you, Helen, but I think not. There isn't anything I can do either. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Maybe I'll hear from Dad again. Nancy looked so downcast that Helen searched her mind to find something which would cheer her friend. Suddenly, Helen had an idea and went to speak to Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary about it. "I think it's a wonderful plan if Nancy will do it," Aunt Rosemary said. Helen called Nancy from the hall and proposed that they all go to the attic to look in the big trunk containing the old costumes. "We might even put them on," Miss Flora proposed, smiling girlishly. "And you girls could dance the minuet," said Aunt Rosemary enthusiastically. "Mother plays the old spinet very well. Maybe she would play a minuet for you." "Oh, I love the idea," said Nancy. She knew that the three were trying to boost her spirits, and she appreciated it. Besides, what they had proposed sounded like fun. All of them trooped up the creaky attic stairs, and in their haste none of the group had remembered to bring flashlights. "Oh, I'll go downstairs and grab a couple," Nancy offered. "Never mind," Aunt Rosemary spoke up. "There are some candles and holders right here. We keep them here for emergencies." She lighted 2 white candles which stood in old-fashioned saucer-type brass holders and led the way to the costume trunk. As Helen lifted the heavy lid, Nancy exclaimed in delight, "How beautiful the clothes are!" She could see silks, satins, and laces at one side. At the other was a folded-up rose velvet robe. She and Helen lifted out the garments and held them up. "They're really lovelier than our formal dance clothes today," Helen remarked, "especially the men's." Miss Flora smiled, "And a lot more flattering." The entire trunk was unpacked before the group selected what they would wear. "This pale green silk gown with the panniers would look lovely on you, Nancy," Miss Flora said, "and I'm sure it's just the right size, too." Nancy surveyed the tiny waist of the ball gown. "I'll try it on," she said. Then laughingly she added, "but I'll probably have to hold my breath to close it in the middle, like that. My, but the women in olden times certainly had slim waistlines." Helen was holding up a man's purple velvet suit. It had knee breeches, and the waistcoat had a lace-ruffled front. There was a tricorn hat, long white stockings, and buckled slippers to complete the costume. "I think I'll wear this and be your partner, Nancy," Helen said. Taking off her pumps, she slid her feet into the buckled slippers. The others laughed aloud. A man with a foot twice the size of Helen had once worn the slippers. "Never mind, I'll stuff the empty space with paper," Helen announced gaily. Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary selected gowns for themselves, then opened a good-sized box at the bottom of the trunk. It contained various kinds of wigs worn in colonial times. All were pure white and fluffy. Carrying the costumes and wigs, the group descended to the bedrooms, where they changed into the fancy clothes, then went to the first floor. Miss Flora led the way into the room across the hall from the parlor. She said it once had been the drawing room. Later it had become a library, but the old spinet still stood in a corner. Miss Flora sat down at the instrument and began to play Beethoven's Minuet. Aunt Rosemary sat down beside her. Nancy and Helen, dubbed by the latter Master and Mistress Colonial America, began to dance. They clasped their right hands together in the air, then took 2 steps backwards and made little bows. They circled and strutted, and even put in a few steps with which no dancers in colonial times would have been familiar. Aunt Rosemary giggled and clapped. "Oh, I wish President Washington would come to see you," she said, acting out her part in the entertainment. "Mistress Nancy, prithee do an encore, and Master Corning, wilt thou accompany thy fair lady?" The girls could barely keep from giggling. Helen made a low bow to her aunt, her tricorn hat in her hand, and said, "At your service, my lady, your every wish is my command." The minuet was repeated, then, as Miss Flora stopped playing, the girls sat down. "Oh, that was so much fun," said Nancy. "Sometimes I'd like to—" "Listen," she commanded suddenly. From outside the house they could hear loud shouting. "Come here, you in the house, come here!" Nancy and Helen dashed from their chairs to the front door. Nancy snapped on the porch light, and the 2 girls raced outside. "Over here!" a man's voice urged. Nancy and Helen ran down the steps and out onto the lawn. Just ahead of them stood Tom Patrick, the police detective. In a vice-like grip he was holding a thin, bent-over man whom the girls judged to be about 50 years of age. "Is this your ghost?" the guard asked. His prisoner was struggling to free himself but was unable to get loose. The girls hurried forward to look at the man. See, there they are, they're all dressed up fancy. And on the bottom it says, "Is this your ghost?" the police guard asked. "I caught him sneaking along the edge of the grounds," Tom Patrick announced. "Let me go!" the man cried out angrily. "I'm no ghost. What are you talking about?" "You may not be a ghost," the detective said, "but you could be the thief who has been robbing this house." "What?" his prisoner exclaimed. "I'm no thief. I live around here. Anyone will tell you I'm okay." "What's your name and where do you live?" the detective prodded. He let the man stand up straight, but held one of his arms firmly. "My name is Albert Watson, and I live over on Tuttle Road." "What were you doing on this property?" Albert Watson said he had been taking a short cut home. His wife had taken their car for the evening. "I had been to a friend's house. You can call him and verify what I'm saying, and you can call my wife, too. Maybe she's home now and she'll come and get me." The guard reminded Albert Watson that he had not revealed why he was sneaking along the ground. "Well," the prisoner said, "it was because of you. I heard downtown that there was a detective patrolling this place and I didn't want to bump into you. I was afraid of just what did happen." Weird. The man relaxed a little. "I guess you're a pretty good guard at that." Detective Patrick let go of Albert Watson's arm. "Your story sounds okay, but we'll go in the house and do some telephoning to find out if you're telling the truth." "You'll find out all right. Why, I'm even a notary public. They don't give a notary's license to dishonest folks," the trespasser insisted. Then he stared at Nancy and Helen. "What are you doing in those funny clothes?" We are having a little costume party," Helen responded. In the excitement, she and Nancy had forgotten what they were wearing. The two girls started for the house, with the men following. When Mr. Watson and the guard saw Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary also in costume, they gazed at the women in amusement. Nancy introduced Mr. Watson. Miss Flora said she knew of him, although she had never met the man. 2 phone calls by the guard confirmed Watson's story. In a little while his wife arrived at Twin Elms to drive her husband home, and Detective Patrick went back to his guard duty. Aunt Rosemary then turned out all the lights on the first floor, and she, Miss Flora, and the girls went upstairs. Bedroom doors were locked, and everyone hoped that there would be no disturbance during the night. "It was a good day, Nancy," said Helen, yawning as she climbed into bed. "Yes, it was," said Nancy. "Of course I'm a little disappointed that we aren't further along solving the mystery, but maybe by this time tomorrow—" She looked toward Helen, who did not answer. She was already sound asleep. Nancy herself was under the covers a few minutes later. She lay staring at the ceiling, going over the various events of the past 2 days. As her mind recalled the scene in the attic when they were pulling costumes from the old trunk, she suddenly gave a start. "That section of wall back of the trunk," she told herself. "The paneling looked different somehow from the rest of the attic wall. Maybe it's movable and leads to a secret exit. Tomorrow I will find out." So that's the end of chapter 9, A Worrisome Delay. And then next time it's going to be chapter 10, The Midnight Watch. Hope you guys liked it. Bye.